Blood seeped from Lillian Eastwood's bare feet as she fled through the snow, each step burning like fire against her frozen skin. The howling January wind of 1876 clawed at her tattered nightgown, but the terror propelling her forward burned hotter than the biting cold of the Colorado wilderness. Behind her, flames consumed the cabin she'd called home for 6 miserable months, her prison under Vernon Blackwell's cruel hand. The man who had promised her father to be a loving husband had shown his true nature the moment they'd arrived at his isolated homestead. Tonight, when his drunken rage had escalated beyond anything before, she'd made her desperate escape while he lay in a stupor. Now, with nothing but moonlight to guide her through the vast expanse of snow-covered hills, Lillian ran blindly, praying for salvation even as her strength waned. Each ragged breath formed a cloud in the frigid air as she pushed forward, her long auburn hair whipping wildly behind her. Miles away, Wyatt Xavier sat before the dying embers in the fireplace of his modest cabin, restlessness keeping him from sleep, despite the exhaustion from a long day of tending to his small cattle herd. Something about the night felt unsettled, as though the howling wind carried a warning he couldn't quite decipher. At 30 years old, Wyatt had spent nearly half his life in this untamed territory, learning its moods and messages like a language spoken only between himself and the land. Tonight, that language told him something was wrong. Rising from his chair, he moved to the window, brushing aside the curtain to peer into the darkness. The full moon illuminated the snow-covered landscape, casting blue shadows across his property. His horses shifted restlessly in the nearby stable, another sign that confirmed his unease. "What's got you bothered, old friend?" he murmured to the wind. As if in answer, his cattle dog, Rusty, suddenly lifted his head from his place by the fire, ears perked forward in alert attention. A low growl rumbled in the dog's chest as he moved toward the door, hackles raised. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and hat, strapped on his revolver, and reached for his rifle. Whatever was out there in the night, he would meet it prepared. "Come on, boy," he said to Rusty as he opened the door, letting in a blast of frigid air. The dog bounded out, disappearing into the snow, his reddish coat quickly swallowed by the darkness. Wyatt saddled his stallion, Midnight, with practiced efficiency, his breath forming clouds in the cold barn air. The horse sensed his urgency, standing steady but alert as Wyatt tightened the cinch and mounted in one fluid motion. Together, they rode out into the night, following Rusty's excited barking that carried through the still air. Wyatt knew these hills and valleys better than any map could show, guiding Midnight along the safest paths despite the darkness. The dog's barking grew more insistent, drawing them toward the eastern edge of Wyatt's property, near the boundary that separated his land from the neighboring claim, a place he rarely visited, due to the unsavory reputation of its owner. As they crested a small ridge, Wyatt spotted Rusty circling something in the snow. At first, he thought perhaps the dog had cornered a wounded animal. But as he drew closer, the moonlight revealed something that made his blood run cold. A woman lay crumpled in the snow, her nightgown torn and bloodied, her bare feet leaving a crimson trail behind her. Her auburn hair spilled across the white ground like spilled wine, and even in the dim light, Wyatt could see she wasn't moving. "Dear God," he breathed, dismounting quickly and rushing to her side. Kneeling beside her, he gently turned her over, brushing the hair from her face. Despite the bruises and the dirt smudged across her features, he could see she was young, perhaps early 20s, and strikingly beautiful even in her current state. "Miss," he called softly, checking for signs of life. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered weakly, revealing glimpses of emerald green before closing again. A soft moan escaped her lips, but she didn't awaken. Looking over his shoulder, Wyatt could see smoke rising in the distance Blackwell's place. He realized with a grim understanding. He'd heard rumors about the man's violent temper, but had kept to himself as most frontier folk did, minding his own business. Now he regretted that choice. "You're safe now," he promised, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I've got you." With gentle hands, he wrapped her in his heavy coat before lifting her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her body frail and chilled to the bone. Holding her securely against his chest, he returned to Midnight, carefully mounting while keeping her cradled in his arms. "Home, boy," he urged the horse, turning back toward his cabin. "And quick about it." The return journey seemed to take an eternity, each step of the horse jostling the unconscious woman in his arms. Wyatt found himself whispering reassurances, though whether they were for her or for himself, he couldn't say. By the time they reached his cabin, her breathing had grown shallow, her skin alarmingly cold against his. Inside, he laid her carefully on his bed, adding logs to the fire until the room blazed with warmth. He worked quickly, gathering clean cloths, a basin of warm water, and the few medical supplies he kept on hand. As a man who had lived alone in the wilderness for years, he'd learned to tend to injuries, though usually his own or his animal's, never a battered woman's. With careful hands, he began cleaning the cuts on her face, his jaw clenching at the obvious handprint bruised into her cheek. Her feet were in worse condition, cut and bleeding from her desperate flight through the snow. He cleaned each wound methodically, applying salve and wrapping them in clean bandages. When he'd done all he could, he covered her with every blanket he owned, then settled into the chair beside the bed to keep watch through the remainder of the night. As the first light of dawn broke through the window, Lillian stirred, consciousness returning in painful waves. Before she even opened her eyes, she tensed, her body anticipating the familiar pain of Vernon's fists. "Easy now," came a gentle voice, not Vernon's harsh tone, but something softer, deeper. "You're safe." Her eyes flew open, fear momentarily overriding her pain as she took in unfamiliar surroundings. Rough-hewn log walls, simple furnishings, the warmth of a crackling fire. And a man tall and broad-shouldered with kind eyes the color of a summer sky watching her with concern. She tried to scramble away, wincing as pain shot through her battered body. "Don't be afraid," the stranger said, keeping his distance. "My name is Wyatt Xavier. I found you in the snow last night. You're at my homestead now. No one's going to hurt you here." Lillian's mind raced, trying to piece together fragmented memories. Vernon's drunken rage, her desperate escape, the burning cold of the snow beneath her bare feet. She had been certain she would die out there in the wilderness. How? Her voice cracked, her throat raw. "My dog found you," Wyatt explained, pouring water from a pitcher into a cup and offering it to her. "You were about half a mile from my property line." She accepted the water with trembling hands, watching him cautiously over the rim as she drank. Despite her fear, she noted the gentleness in his movements, so unlike Vernon's threatening posture. "Thank you," she managed after satisfying her thirst. "I'm Lillian Eastwood," she hesitated, not wanting to claim her married name. "Miss Eastwood," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Your feet are pretty torn up and you've got some nasty bruises. You should rest." "I can't stay," she said, sudden panic rising in her chest. "If he finds me, Blackwell?" Wyatt asked, his expression darkening. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "He won't come here," Wyatt assured her, his voice steady and certain. "And if he did, he wouldn't leave in one piece." The quiet conviction in his tone wasn't boastful or threatening, just a simple statement of fact. Lillian studied him, this stranger who had saved her life. He wasn't what she'd expected from the rugged frontiersman she'd encountered since coming west. Though he clearly bore the hallmarks of a life lived outdoors: sun-weathered skin, calloused hands, and the lean, muscular build of a man accustomed to physical labor, there was a gentleness to him that seemed at odds with his environment. "Are you hungry?" he asked, breaking the silence. As if in answer, her stomach growled audibly, bringing a flush of embarrassment to her cheeks and a small smile to his lips. "I'll take that as a yes," he said, moving to the small stove in the corner. "It's not fancy, but I make a decent breakfast." Lillian watched as he moved efficiently around the small space, adding wood to the stove, mixing batter for biscuits, frying bacon in a cast-iron skillet. There was something hypnotic about his movements, a confidence born of routine. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, partly to distract herself from the pain pulsing through her body, partly because she found herself genuinely curious about this solitary man. "Going on 8 years," he replied, not looking up from his cooking. "Came out from Pennsylvania after the war, wanted open skies and quiet." "You fought in the war?" she asked. He nodded, a shadow crossing his features. "Union cavalry. Saw things no man should see, came west to forget them." The simple honesty of his words struck her. In her experience, men either boasted about their war exploits or refused to speak of them at all. This quiet acknowledgement of pain felt like a rare glimpse into his true character. "I came west because my father arranged my marriage," she offered in return, surprised at her own candor. "He thought he was securing my future." Wyatt glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Some security," he said finally, his voice low. The bitterness in his tone was not directed at her, she realized, but at the situation at Vernon, at her father, at a society that treated women as property to be traded. When he placed a plate of food before her, biscuits, bacon, and scrambled eggs, the simple kindness of the gesture brought tears to her eyes. How long had it been since anyone had shown her basic human decency? "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for the food," he nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Eat," he urged gently. "You'll need your strength." As they ate in companionable silence, Lillian found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. His dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples despite his relatively young age, was cut shorter than most men wore it on the frontier. His beard was neatly trimmed, framing a face that spoke of hardship but hadn't been hardened by it. "What will you do now?" he asked finally, setting aside his empty plate. The question crashed through her momentary peace, bringing reality crashing back. What could she do? She had no money, no family in this territory, no skills that would allow her to support herself. And Vernon would be looking for her, of that she had no doubt. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice small. "I can't go back." "No," he agreed firmly. "You can't. But I have nowhere to go." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. "You can stay here," he said finally, "until you heal, until you figure things out." Lillian stared at him, searching for ulterior motives in his offer, conditioned by months with Vernon to expect the worst from men. But his expression remained open, honest. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" she asked. He met her gaze directly. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because I've seen enough suffering in this life to know I don't want to add to it." Something in his words resonated deep within her, touching a part of her soul that had begun to wither under Vernon's cruelty. This man, this stranger, saw her humanity when her own husband had treated her as less than human. "I don't want to be a burden," she said. "You won't be," he assured her. "Rest today. Tomorrow we'll talk more." And so began Lillian's stay at Wyatt Xavier's homestead, a temporary refuge that would change both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. The next few days passed in a haze of pain and healing for Lillian. Her body, already weakened from months of Vernon's abuse and inadequate food, struggled to recover from her ordeal in the snow. A fever set in the second night, leaving her delirious and trembling beneath the pile of blankets on Wyatt's bed. Through it all, Wyatt tended to her with a gentle patience that amazed her in her more lucid moments. He bathed her forehead with cool cloths, coaxed her to drink broth and water, and changed the bandages on her feet with careful hands that never caused her additional pain. When the fever finally broke on the fourth day, Lillian awoke to find herself alone in the cabin, sunlight streaming through the windows. For the first time, she took in her surroundings properly. The cabin was simple but meticulously maintained. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel holding a few books and a carved wooden horse. The furniture was sturdy and functional: a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the fire, a chest of drawers against the wall. Everything spotlessly clean, everything in its place. The door opened, and Wyatt entered, bringing with him a blast of cold air and the scent of the outdoors. Seeing her awake, he smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face and crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You're back with us," he said, setting down a basket of firewood. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said, her voice stronger than it had been. "Thank you for taking care of me," he shrugged, seeming almost embarrassed by her gratitude. "You had us worried for a while there." "Us?" "Me and Rusty," he clarified, gesturing to the cattle dog who had followed him inside and now approached the bed cautiously, as if sensing Lillian's fragility. "He's been keeping watch with me." Lillian extended her hand to the dog, who sniffed it tentatively before giving her fingers a gentle lick. She smiled at the simple acceptance. "Has there been any news?" she asked hesitantly, dreading the answer but needing to know. "From Blackwell's place?" Wyatt's expression darkened slightly. "Some. I rode into town yesterday for supplies. Word is Blackwell's telling anyone who'll listen that his wife ran off after setting fire to their cabin." Lillian flinched. "I didn't set the fire." "I figured as much," Wyatt said. "Man like that, he probably knocked over a lantern in one of his drunken rages. Easier to blame you than admit his own failings." "Is he looking for me?" The question caught in her throat. "He's asking around," Wyatt acknowledged grimly, "offering a reward for information. But no one's seen you, and I didn't tell anyone you were here. Most folks in town don't have much love for Blackwell anyway." Relief washed over her, tempered by the knowledge that her freedom remained precarious. Vernon wasn't a man who gave up easily, especially when his pride was wounded. "I need to leave," she said, pushing herself up to a sitting position, ignoring the pain that shot through her still healing feet. "I'm putting you in danger just by being here." "You're not going anywhere on those feet," Wyatt said firmly, moving to gently ease her back against the pillows. "And you're not putting me in danger. I can handle myself." His hands were warm and strong on her shoulders, his touch carefully respectful even in his insistence. Lillian found herself relaxing under that touch, trusting him despite years of learning to distrust men's intentions. "Besides," he continued, his voice softening, "where would you go? Winter's setting in hard. Even if your feet were healed, traveling alone would be dangerous." He was right, and they both knew it. The harsh reality of her situation settled over her like a heavy blanket. She was trapped, if not by Vernon, then by circumstance, by the unforgiving wilderness, by her own vulnerability. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, hating the weakness in her voice. Wyatt pulled a chair close to the bed and sat, his expression serious but kind. "Right now, you don't need to do anything except heal. We've got time to figure out the rest." "We?" The word caught her by surprise. "Unless you'd rather face this alone," he said, a question in his eyes. Lillian studied him, this man who had become her unlikely protector. In the short time she'd known him, he had shown her more kindness than she'd experienced in years. There was something about him that invited trust, a steadiness, a quiet strength that didn't demand acknowledgement. "No," she said finally. "I wouldn't rather face it alone." His smile returned, small but genuine. "Good. Now are you hungry? You've barely eaten in days." As if on cue, her stomach growled loudly, bringing a flush to her cheeks and a chuckle from Wyatt. "I'll take that as a yes," he said, rising. "Let's get some food in you." The routine they established over the next week was simple but comforting. Wyatt would rise before dawn to tend to his livestock, returning to prepare breakfast which they would share in companionable conversation. He would then see to his daily chores while Lillian rested or read from his small collection of books. In the afternoons, he helped her take short walks around the cabin, supporting her weight as her feet gradually healed. The first time she stood without assistance was a victory they celebrated with apple pie Wyatt had purchased from the general store on one of his infrequent trips to town. As her strength returned, Lillian began to contribute to the household in small ways, mending Wyatt's clothes, preparing simple meals, keeping the cabin tidy. These tasks, which had been joyless drudgery under Vernon's critical eye, became acts of gratitude in Wyatt's home. They talked, too tentatively at first, then with growing ease. She told him of her childhood in Boston, of her father's shipping business, of her dreams of becoming a teacher before her marriage had been arranged. He spoke of his Pennsylvania farm upbringing, his time in the cavalry, his journey west to start anew. "Why cattle?" she asked one evening as they sat before the fire, the snow falling heavily outside. "Why not continue farming?" Wyatt considered the question, absently running his fingers through Rusty's fur as the dog dozed at his feet. "Farming ties you to the land in a different way," he said finally. "After the war, I couldn't bear to be rooted too deeply. Cattle ranching gives me movement, open spaces." "You were looking for freedom," she observed. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers across the space between them. "Weren't we all?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with shared understanding. They had both come west seeking something, he to escape the ghosts of war, she to fulfill familial expectations, and both had found something very different from what they'd anticipated. As winter deepened, the snow often made it impossible for Wyatt to ride into town. Their isolation should have frightened Lillian, but instead she found it strangely liberating. In this small cabin, miles from the nearest neighbor, she was beginning to rediscover parts of herself that Vernon had systematically destroyed: her humor, her opinions, her capacity for joy. And through it all, there was Wyatt. Patient, steady Wyatt, who never raised his voice, who asked for her thoughts as if they mattered, who looked at her not as property but as a person worthy of respect. She didn't recognize her feelings for what they were at first. Gratitude, she told herself. Friendship. The natural affection that grows between people who share hardship and healing. But then came the night of the blizzard, when the wind howled like a living thing around the cabin walls, and even the normally stoic Wyatt seemed concerned. "I've never seen it this bad," he admitted, securing the shutters against the storm. "Not in all my years here." Lillian watched him from her place by the fire, noting the tension in his shoulders, the worry in his eyes. "Will the animals be all right?" "The barn's solid," he said, though he glanced toward the window as if he could see through the shuttered glass to the structure beyond. "I brought the most vulnerable stock into the main shelter earlier." A particularly violent gust rattled the cabin, making them both jump. Rusty whined, pressing closer to Lillian's legs. This is going to be a long night, Wyatt sighed, adding more wood to the fire. They tried to distract themselves with conversation, with a game of checkers played on a board Wyatt had carved himself, but the storm's fury made concentration difficult. When a loud crack split the night air, followed by a heavy thud against the roof, Wyatt was on his feet instantly. "Stay here," he ordered, reaching for his coat. "I need to check that. You can't go out in this," Lillian protested, rising to block his path. "If a tree's fallen on the roof, I need to know," he insisted. "If it's damaged, the snow will get in." "Then I'm coming with you," she said, reaching for her own coat, actually his spare one, which engulfed her smaller frame. He looked as if he wanted to argue, but then nodded curtly. "Stay close to me. If I tell you to run back inside, you do it. No questions." They ventured out into the storm together, the wind immediately stealing their breath, the snow blinding in its intensity. Wyatt wrapped a protective arm around Lillian's shoulders, guiding her along the side of the cabin to where a large branch had indeed broken off from a nearby pine and fallen across one corner of the roof. "It doesn't look like it broke through," he shouted over the wind. "But we need to get it off before its weight causes damage." Together, they struggled with the heavy branch, their hands numbing quickly despite their gloves. When it finally slid off the roof to land with a muffled thud in the snow, Lillian nearly collapsed with relief. "Inside," Wyatt urged, already leading her back toward the door. They stumbled back into the cabin, snow melting from their coats and hair, their cheeks stinging from the cold. As they removed their wet outer garments, their eyes met, and something passed between them, a shared moment of triumph against the elements, of partnership in adversity. Without thinking, Lillian stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Wyatt's waist, pressing her face against his chest. She felt him stiffen in surprise, then gradually relax, his own arms coming up to encircle her gently. "Thank you," she murmured against the rough fabric of his shirt. "For everything." His hand came up to stroke her hair, a touch so tender it nearly undid her. "You don't need to thank me, Lillian." She pulled back slightly to look up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth of his body against hers, of the way his blue eyes darkened as they gazed down at her. "I want to," she whispered. For a moment she thought he might kiss her. His gaze dropped to her lips, his head inclined slightly, and her heart thundered in her chest. But then he stepped back, gentle but definitive, putting space between them. "You should get warm," he said, his voice rough. "I'll make some coffee." Lillian stood frozen, a confusing mix of disappointment and embarrassment washing over her. Had she misread the situation so completely? Had she offended him with her forwardness? As she watched him move to the stove, his back to her as he busied himself with the coffee pot, a terrible thought occurred to her. Perhaps he saw her only as a responsibility, a burden he had taken on out of duty rather than any deeper feeling. The thought chilled her more thoroughly than the storm outside. 2 days later, the blizzard finally abated, leaving the world transformed under a pristine blanket of snow nearly 4 feet deep in places. Wyatt spent most of the day digging paths to the barn and checking on his cattle, returning to the cabin only for brief meals before heading back out. Lillian watched him through the window, noting the careful distance he had maintained since the night of the storm. Their conversations had grown stilted, their easy companionship replaced by an awkwardness that pained her. When he finally came in for the evening, exhausted and chilled, she had dinner waiting, venison stew that had been simmering all day, filling the cabin with its rich aroma. "You didn't have to cook," he said, hanging his coat by the door. "I wanted to," she replied, setting the table. "You've been working so hard." They ate in silence, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional whine from Rusty, who sensed the tension between them. When they had finished, Wyatt pushed back from the table with a sigh. "Lillian, we need to talk." Her stomach tightened with dread. Here it came he was going to ask her to leave. Now that the worst of winter had passed, he no longer felt obligated to shelter her. "I think it's time we discussed your situation," he continued, confirming her fears. "I understand," she said quickly, rising to gather the dishes, needing movement to hide her distress. "The weather's improving. I can be ready to leave in a day or two." Wyatt stared at her, confusion evident on his face. "Leave? What are you talking about?" Now it was her turn to be confused. "Isn't that what you want to discuss? My leaving?" "No," he said, shaking his head emphatically. "That's not what I meant at all." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of his frustration. "Sit down, please. This isn't coming out right." Cautiously, Lillian returned to her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been thinking about your legal situation," Wyatt explained. "Blackwell is still looking for you. As your husband, he has rights under the law that I don't like, but that exist nonetheless." Lillian's heart sank. She had tried not to dwell on this harsh reality, but of course it couldn't be avoided forever. "There's a lawyer in town," Wyatt continued. "Arthur Thompson. He's a good man. I spoke with him yesterday when I went in for supplies." "You told him about me?" Lillian asked, alarmed. "Not specifically," Wyatt assured her. "I posed it as a hypothetical situation. He said that given evidence of mistreatment, a woman might be granted a divorce on grounds of cruelty, but it would require witnesses, documentation." "I have neither," Lillian said, despair creeping into her voice. "Vernon was careful. The abuse happened behind closed doors. And any bruises I have healed." "Not all of them," Wyatt said quietly, his eyes dropping to her hands where faint scars remained from defensive wounds. "And there might be other ways to prove his character. Thompson mentioned that Blackwell has a reputation. There have been incidents in town. Fights, accusations from saloon girls. A pattern of behavior, Lillian realized, one that might lend credibility to her claims. Even so, she said, pursuing a divorce would mean revealing myself, going to court. Vernon would fight it not because he wants me, but because his pride wouldn't allow him to be publicly humiliated. I know it's a risk, Wyatt acknowledged, but the alternative is living in hiding for the rest of your life, always looking over your shoulder, never truly free. The truth of his words struck her forcefully. Is that what she wanted? A life of fear and concealment? What if he finds me before the divorce can be granted? She asked, voicing her deepest fear. What if he takes me back by force? Wyatt leaned forward, his expression more intense than she had ever seen it. I won't let that happen, he said, his voice low and fierce. I promise you, Lillian, he will never hurt you again. The conviction in his words, the protectiveness in his gaze, sent a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the fire. Why are you doing all this? She asked, the question that had been on her mind since the night he found her in the snow. Why risk so much for a stranger? Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. You're not a stranger to me anymore, he said finally. And some things are worth the risk. The weight of unspoken feelings hung in the air between them, tangible as the tension before a summer storm. Lillian found herself holding her breath, waiting for him to continue, to put into words what she hoped she saw in his eyes. But again, he pulled back, rising from the table and moving to the fire as if seeking its warmth. Think about what I've said, about the divorce. It's your decision, of course. I just wanted you to know there might be a path to freedom. Freedom. The word echoed in Lillian's mind long after they had gone to bed, she in Wyatt's bed as always, he on the pallet by the fire that he had insisted was comfortable enough. Freedom from Vernon, yes. But what then? What kind of life could she build for herself as a divorced woman in a territory where unattached females were viewed either as commodities or curiosities? And what of her growing feelings for Wyatt? Feelings that seemed increasingly unlikely to be returned, given his careful distance these past days. Sleep eluded her as she turned these questions over in her mind, watching the moonlight cast shadows across the cabin ceiling. Outside, an owl called, its mournful hoot somehow underlining her solitude. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like an acknowledgement of an inevitable path. She would seek the divorce, not just to be free of Vernon, but to be truly free to have agency over her own life, whatever shape that life might take. With that resolution came a kind of peace that finally allowed her to drift into sleep, her dreams filled with images of open skies and endless possibilities. The following week brought a break in the winter weather, with temperatures rising enough to begin melting the deep snow. Wyatt rode into town to speak with the lawyer, Thompson, and returned with news that both encouraged and alarmed Lillian. "Thompson believes you have a case," he reported as they sat at the kitchen table, a map of the territory spread between them. "Especially with what he's been able to learn about Blackwell's reputation. But he needs to meet with you to take your statement. In town." Lillian asked, anxiety tightening her chest. Wyatt nodded. "It's risky, I know, but Thompson has a plan. He's arranged for you to come to his office through the back entrance after dark. No one should see you. And if Vernon is there," the fear in her voice was palpable. "Thompson says Blackwell usually spends his evenings at the saloon," Wyatt assured her, "and I'll be with you every step of the way." She studied the map, tracing the route from Wyatt's homestead to the small town of Pinecrest. It wasn't a long journey, perhaps 2 hours on horseback in good weather, but it felt like crossing an ocean, so accustomed had she become to the safety of their isolation. "When?" she asked finally. "Tomorrow night," Wyatt said. "Thompson believes the sooner we begin the process, the better. Especially since—" He hesitated. "Since what?" "Since Blackwell seems to be escalating his search," Wyatt admitted reluctantly. "He's offering more money for information, and he's been making threats about what he'll do when he finds you." The chill that ran down Lillian's spine had nothing to do with the winter air. She knew all too well that Vernon's threats weren't idle. The man harbored a darkness that few who encountered his charming public persona ever glimpsed. "Then we have no choice," she said, straightening her shoulders. "I'll go tomorrow." Wyatt reached across the table to cover her hand with his, a rare breach of the careful physical distance he had maintained since the night of the blizzard. "You're the bravest woman I've ever known, Lillian Eastwood." The warmth of his touch, the admiration in his eyes, gave her a courage she hadn't known she possessed. In that moment, she vowed to herself that she would see this through, not just for her safety, but for the chance at a life where such simple human connections weren't clouded by fear. The journey to town the following evening was tense, with both Wyatt and Lillian hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in the gathering darkness. They rode double on midnight, Lillian seated behind Wyatt, her arms wrapped around his waist for stability. Despite the circumstances, she couldn't help but notice the solid strength of him, the way his body moved in perfect harmony with the horse's gait. Pinecrest appeared first as a glow on the horizon, then gradually took shape as a small but bustling frontier town, a main street lined with wooden buildings, side streets branching off to residential areas, the silhouette of a church steeple rising against the night sky. Wyatt guided Midnight down a back alley, avoiding the main thoroughfare where the saloon blazed with light and raucous laughter spilled into the street. They dismounted behind a modest building with a small wooden sign identifying it as Arthur Thompson, attorney at law. A tap on the back door brought a quick response. A thin, bespectacled man with a neatly trimmed beard opened it just wide enough to peer out before ushering them inside. "Mrs. Blackwell," he greeted Lillian in hushed tones. "And Mr. Xavier, thank you for coming. Please, my office is this way." Lillian flinched at the use of her married name, a reaction not lost on the perceptive lawyer. "I apologize," he said as he led them into a well-appointed office lit by several oil lamps. "Would you prefer I call you Miss Eastwood?" "Yes," Lillian replied, gratitude warming her voice. "If you don't mind." "Not at all." Thompson gestured toward two chairs placed before a large desk strewn with legal tomes and papers. "Please sit. Can I offer you coffee? Tea?" They declined, and Thompson took his own seat behind the desk, his expression turning serious as he extracted a blank legal pad from a drawer. "Mr. Xavier has outlined your situation to me," he began, his tone professional yet compassionate. "But I need to hear the details from you, Miss Eastwood. I must warn you that some of my questions may be difficult to answer, but the more specific information you can provide about the mistreatment you suffered, the stronger our case will be." Lillian nodded, steeling herself. "I understand." For the next hour, she recounted her marriage to Vernon Blackwell from the initial courtship in Boston, where he had presented himself as a successful and gentlemanly rancher, through the journey west during which his true nature had begun to emerge, to the nightmare of daily life on his isolated homestead. She described the progression of abuse, verbal at first, then physical, escalating in both frequency and severity. She spoke of being denied adequate food, of being locked in the root cellar for days when she displeased him, of the constant fear that one day his rage would go too far and she would not survive. Throughout her testimony, Wyatt sat silent beside her, his face a mask of controlled anger, his fists clenched so tightly on the arms of his chair that his knuckles showed white. Once, when her voice faltered as she described a particularly brutal beating, his hand moved as if to offer comfort, then withdrew, that careful distance reasserted. Thompson took meticulous notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing Lillian to tell her story in her own words. When she finally fell silent, emotionally drained by the recounting, he set down his pen and regarded her with genuine sympathy. "Thank you, Miss Eastwood. I know that couldn't have been easy." He shuffled his notes, organizing them with practiced efficiency. "Based on what you've told me and the corroborating evidence I've gathered regarding Mr. Blackwell's character, I believe we have solid grounds for a divorce on the basis of extreme cruelty." Relief washed over Lillian, so profound she felt momentarily lightheaded. "How long will the process take?" "That's where things become complicated," Thompson admitted. "Normally, I would file the petition with the territorial court immediately. However, given Mr. Blackwell's current agitation, I have concerns about your safety once he is served with divorce papers. He will know you are alive and in the area." The momentary relief evaporated, replaced by the familiar cold dread. "What do you suggest?" Wyatt asked, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the office. Thompson removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully on a handkerchief before responding. "I suggest we wait until the spring circuit court arrives. Judge Harrington will be presiding, and he's known for his progressive views regarding women's rights in divorce cases. More importantly, his presence will bring additional law enforcement to town marshals who can ensure Miss Eastwood's safety during the proceedings." "Spring," Lillian echoed, dismay evident in her voice. "That's months away." "I know it seems like a long time," Thompson acknowledged, "but it might be the safest approach. In the meantime, I'll prepare all the necessary documentation, Gather statements from witnesses who can attest to Mr. Blackwell's violent tendencies and build the strongest possible case. Lillian glanced at Wyatt, seeking his opinion. His expression was troubled, but he nodded slowly. "The lawyer's right. Your safety has to be the priority." "Where will I stay until then?" she asked, though she already knew the answer she hoped for. It was Thompson who responded, his gaze moving between Lillian and Wyatt with shrewd assessment. "I think it's best if as few people as possible know your whereabouts, Miss Eastwood. Mr. Xavier's homestead seems to have provided adequate refuge thus far." "She's welcome to stay as long as necessary," Wyatt said quietly, not meeting Lillian's eyes. A strange mixture of emotions swirled within her: gratitude for his continued protection, disappointment at his evident reluctance, and a deeper confusion about her own feelings. Was she beginning to see Wyatt as more than a savior, more than a friend? And if so, what did that say about her? A woman not yet free from one man already harboring feelings for another. The journey back to the homestead was quieter than their ride into town, both Lillian and Wyatt lost in their own thoughts. The meeting with Thompson had clarified their legal path forward, but had also illuminated the complexity of their situation in ways neither had fully confronted before. As they approached the cabin, the familiar silhouette of its roof against the starlit sky brought an unexpected sense of homecoming to Lillian. In the few months she had spent here, this place had become more of a home than Vernon's larger, more established ranch had ever been. Wyatt helped her dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. In the silvery moonlight, his expression was unreadable, but something in the set of his shoulders, the tension in his jaw, suggested an internal struggle. "Wyatt," she ventured as he turned to lead Midnight to the barn. "Is something wrong?" He paused, his back to her, then shook his head without turning around. "It's nothing. Go on inside. I'll be in after I see to the horse." Lillian watched him disappear into the darkness of the barn, concern furrowing her brow. Something had shifted between them tonight, but she couldn't pinpoint what or why. Inside the cabin, she lit the lamps and stoked the banked fire, the familiar tasks grounding her after the emotional tumult of the evening. By the time Wyatt returned, she had water heating for coffee and had set out bread and cheese on the table. "You should eat something," she said as he hung his coat by the door. "It's been a long day." He nodded, moving to the table but remaining standing as if uncertain of his place in his own home. "How are you feeling, after everything with Thompson?" "Relieved, I think," she said, bringing the coffee pot to the table. "Scared too, but mostly hopeful for the first time in a long time." "Good," he said, his voice soft. "You deserve hope, Lillian." The way he said her name like something precious, something cherished, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the winter chill. "Wyatt," she began, gathering her courage, "I need to ask you something." He finally met her gaze, those blue eyes wary but steady. "Ask." "Why have you been keeping your distance from me, since the night of the blizzard?" The question tumbled out in a rush, weeks of confusion and hurt behind it. Wyatt looked away, his hands coming to rest on the back of a chair, gripping it as if for support. For a long moment he was silent, and Lillian feared he wouldn't answer. "Because I'm afraid," he said finally, the admission clearly costing him. "Afraid of what?" "Of feeling things I have no right to feel." He looked up then, his expression raw with an emotion Lillian had begun to suspect but had scarcely dared to hope for. "You're still married, Lillian. You came to me for protection, not for anything else. I won't take advantage of your vulnerability. I won't be that kind of man." The realization of what he was saying, what he was feeling, left her momentarily speechless. All this time, she had feared her growing attraction was one-sided, when in fact He had been battling the same feelings, restraining them out of respect for her situation. "Wyatt," she said softly, moving around the table to stand before him. "You are nothing like Vernon, nothing like any man I've ever known." "That doesn't change the fact that you're not free," he said, though he didn't back away from her approach. "And it doesn't change the fact that you're dependent on me right now. I won't use that power imbalance to what?" she interrupted, a spark of something like anger flaring within her. "To acknowledge what's happening between us. To admit that in all this darkness something good might be growing." "Lillian," he began, his voice strained. "No," she said firmly. "Listen to me. For months Vernon made all my decisions for me, controlled every aspect of my life. I won't let fear yours or mine make my choices now." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I care for you, Wyatt, not because you saved me, not because I'm grateful, but because of who you are, how you treat me, how you see me." The confession hung in the air between them, as tangible as the steam rising from the forgotten coffee. Wyatt stood frozen, conflict written across his features, desire warring with principle. "I care for you too," he admitted finally, the words rough with emotion. "More than I should, more than is wise." "But no buts," she said, reaching up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his weathered cheek. "Just this truth for now, the rest we can figure out as we go." For a heartbeat, he remained still under her touch. Then, with a sound that was half surrender, half relief, he leaned into her hand, his eyes closing briefly. "I don't want to hurt you," he whispered. "You won't," she said, with a certainty that surprised even her. When he opened his eyes again, the warmth in them nearly took her breath away. Slowly, giving her every chance to retreat, he raised his own hand to cover hers against his cheek. "We'll take this slow," he said, both promise and caution in his voice. "One day at a time." Lillian nodded, understanding the boundaries he was setting, respecting the honor that drove him even as a part of her yearned for more. "One day at a time," she agreed. And in that moment, with the fire crackling behind them and the vast, star-filled sky above the little cabin, that seemed like enough a beginning, a possibility, a future stretching out before them one day at a time. Winter gradually gave way to spring, the snow receding to reveal tender green shoots and early wildflowers dotting the hills around the homestead. With the changing season came a shift in Lillian and Wyatt's relationship, cautious but undeniable, like the gradual warming of the earth after a long freeze. True to his word, Wyatt took things slowly. There were no declarations, no passionate embraces, but there were 1,000 small moments that spoke volumes. His hand lingering on hers when passing a cup of coffee, the way his eyes sought her out across the room, the smile that seemed reserved only for her. As Lillian's strength fully returned, she took on more responsibilities around the homestead, learning the rhythms of ranch life with an enthusiasm that delighted Wyatt. He taught her to ride properly, not side saddle, as she had been trained in Boston, but astride like the frontier women who valued practicality over Eastern propriety. He showed her how to tend the vegetable garden that would provide much of their food in the coming months, how to milk the 2 dairy cows, even how to shoot the rifle that hung above the door, just in case, he'd said, though neither mentioned the specific threat they both feared. Through it all, they really talked in a way Lillian had never experienced with any man. Wyatt listened to her thoughts, valued her opinions, shared his own uncertainties and hopes. In those conversations beside the fire, or while working side by side, Lillian felt herself becoming more fully herself than she had been in years, perhaps ever. "I never thought I could feel this free while still technically being another man's wife," she confessed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Wyatt glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. Freedom isn't just about legal documents, it's a state of mind too. Is that what you found out here? She asked. Freedom, he considered the question, his gaze returning to the horizon. I found quiet, he said finally. Space to heal from the war, purpose in the work, but freedom. He shook his head slightly. I don't think I knew what that meant until recently. And now, his eyes found hers again, blue and steady in the fading light. Now I think maybe it's about choice, choosing your own path, choosing who to let into your life. A small smile tugged at his lips. Choosing who to care about, even when it complicates everything. The simple honesty of his words warmed her more thoroughly than any fire could have. In Vernon's world, everything had been calculation and control. In Wyatt's, there was this straightforward acknowledgement of feeling without demands or expectations. I've made my choices, she said softly. I don't regret them. His hand found hers on the porch rail, strong fingers entwining with her more delicate ones. Neither do I. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities, until Rusty's sudden barking broke the spell. The dog was on his feet at the edge of the yard, hackles raised, staring intently down the trail that led to the main road. Wyatt was on his feet instantly, his relaxed demeanor replaced by alert tension. Get inside, he told Lillian, his voice low and urgent. Now. She obeyed without question, recognizing the seriousness in his tone, but paused at the door. What is it? Probably nothing, he said, though his hand had moved to rest on the revolver at his hip. But Rusty doesn't bark at nothing. Go on, I'll check it out. From the window, Lillian watched as Wyatt moved toward the edge of the property, Rusty at his heels. The dog continued to bark, focused on something or someone beyond Lillian's line of sight. Minutes stretched like hours as she waited, her heart pounding in her chest. When Wyatt finally returned to the cabin, his expression was grim. Someone was there, he confirmed, hanging his hat by the door. Horse tracks fresh, whoever it was left in a hurry when Rusty started barking. Vernon. The name came out in a whisper. Can't say for sure, Wyatt admitted. But it seems like too much of a coincidence to be a random traveler. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she now recognized as a sign of his agitation. He might have gotten wind that you're here, or he might be checking all the isolated homesteads in the area. Fear, which had receded to a distant concern during the peaceful months at the homestead, came rushing back with paralyzing force. What do we do? Wyatt's jaw set in determination. We move up our timeline. Thompson said the circuit judge would be in Pinecrest next week. We'll go to town tomorrow, file the divorce petition immediately. But what if Vernon sees me? The prospect of confronting her husband after all this time sent cold dread coursing through her veins. He won't, Wyatt promised. We'll stay at Thompson's office until the judge can hear your case. The lawyer has a back room where you can sleep. I'll stand guard. And if Vernon comes looking, Wyatt's expression hardened in a way she had never seen before, not angry exactly, but implacably resolved. Then he'll find me instead of you, and he'll learn that not all men can be bullied. The confidence in his voice, the steady assurance of his protection, helped calm the panic rising within her. Yet even as she felt grateful for his strength, a new worry took shape. I don't want you to get hurt because of me, she said, moving to stand before him. Vernon is dangerous, Wyatt. More than you know. I'm not exactly helpless myself, he reminded her gently, and some things are worth fighting for. His gaze held hers, steady and certain. Some people are worth fighting for. The simplicity of the declaration, the depth of feeling behind it, brought tears to Lillian's eyes. In that moment, she knew with absolute clarity that whatever happened in the coming days, Her heart had already made its choice, had perhaps made it on that first night when she awoke to find herself safe in a stranger's cabin, tended with a gentleness she had forgotten could exist. "I love you," she said, the words escaping before she could consider their wisdom. "I know I shouldn't say it, not yet, not while I'm still tied to him, but if something happens tomorrow, I couldn't bear for you not to know." For a heartbeat, Wyatt stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Then, with a movement so swift it took her by surprise, he closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite tenderness. "Nothing's going to happen tomorrow," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I love you too, Lillian Eastwood. Have since the moment you opened your eyes and looked at me that first morning, bruised and terrified but still fighting." And then he was kissing her, a first kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey, like finding something precious thought lost forever. His lips were gentle against hers, asking rather than demanding, offering rather than taking. Lillian melted into him, her hands finding their way to his shoulders, then the nape of his neck, fingers threading through his dark hair. When they finally parted, both breathing unevenly, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he murmured, "remember this. Remember us just as we are right now." Lillian nodded, her heart too full for words. In a world that had shown her mostly cruelty, this man had given her kindness, respect, and now love. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the strength that love had restored to her. They left for town before dawn the next day, taking a circuitous route to avoid the main trails where they might be observed. Wyatt had insisted Lillian wear his spare clothes, trousers, shirt, and hat to disguise her as a young man from a distance. With her hair tucked up and her slender frame hidden beneath the oversized garments, the deception was surprisingly effective. They reached Pinecrest as the town was just beginning to stir, the early morning light casting long shadows along the quiet streets. Thompson was waiting for them at the back door of his office, as promised, ushering them inside with anxious glances up and down the alley. "I was beginning to worry," the lawyer said, locking the door behind them. "There's been development." "What kind of development?" Wyatt asked sharply. Thompson removed his spectacles, polishing them nervously on his handkerchief. "Blackwell was in town yesterday asking questions, specifically about you, Mr. Xavier." "Me?" Wyatt frowned. "What kind of questions? Whether you lived alone, whether anyone had seen a woman at your property." Thompson replaced his glasses, his expression grave. "I believe he suspects Miss Eastwood may be with you." Lillian sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "How? We've been so careful." "Frontier towns run on gossip," Thompson said with a sigh. "Perhaps someone saw Mr. Xavier buying women's items at the general store. Perhaps a traveler glimpsed you on the property. It doesn't take much." "Then we need to move quickly," Wyatt said, his stance alert, protective. "You said the circuit judge arrives today." "This afternoon," Thompson confirmed. "I've already prepared all the necessary paperwork for Miss Eastwood's divorce petition. As soon as Judge Harrington is settled, I'll request an immediate hearing based on the urgent nature of the situation." "And until then?" Lillian asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Until then, you both stay here, out of sight," Thompson said firmly. "My clerk is trustworthy, he'll bring food and any news. My back room isn't luxurious, but it has a cot and is secure." The hours that followed were among the most tense Lillian had ever experienced, worse in some ways than the night of her escape from Vernon. Then, fear had driven her forward. Now, forced inactivity made each minute stretch painfully as they waited for word from Thompson, who had gone to meet the arriving judge. Wyatt paced the small room like a caged animal, his usual stillness replaced by restless energy. Occasionally, he would pause at the small window that overlooked the back alley, scanning for any sign of threat before resuming his pacing. "He won't find us here," Lillian said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "And even if he did, we have the law on our side now." Wyatt gave her a look that spoke volumes about his opinion of the law's effectiveness against men like Vernon Blackwell. "I'm not taking any chances," he said, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "Not with your safety." She rose from the cot where she'd been sitting, moving to stand before him, halting his pacing with a gentle hand on his chest. "Our safety," she corrected. "We're in this together now." The tension in his posture eased slightly at her touch, a hint of a smile softening his worried expression. "Together," he agreed, covering her hand with his own. The sound of the office door opening brought them both to alert attention. Thompson entered, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. "Judge Harrington has agreed to hear your case immediately," he announced. He was quite moved by the details of your situation, Miss Eastwood. "Then it's happening?" Lillian asked, hardly daring to believe. "Today," Thompson nodded. "In 1 hour at the courthouse. The judge has also issued a temporary restraining order against Mr. Blackwell, forbidding him from approaching you before, during, or after the hearing." "A piece of paper won't stop Vernon if he's determined," Lillian said, voicing the fear they all shared. "Which is why the judge has also instructed the town marshal to provide security," Thompson added. "Marshal Reynolds and 2 deputies will escort us to the courthouse and remain present throughout the proceedings." Wyatt's skeptical expression suggested he placed more faith in his own ability to protect Lillian than in the local law enforcement, but he nodded his acceptance of the plan. "And after, if the divorce is granted, then Miss Eastwood will be legally free of her marriage," Thompson said, "free to return to her family in the East or—" his gaze moved meaningfully between Lillian and Wyatt, "or to build a new life wherever she chooses." The implication wasn't lost on either of them. For the first time, Lillian allowed herself to truly contemplate a future with Wyatt not as a refugee under his protection, but as a woman free to make her own choices, to love openly. "One step at a time," Wyatt said quietly, though his eyes, when they met Lillian's, were full of promise. The hour passed with agonizing slowness, Lillian changing back into her own clothes for the court appearance while Thompson reviewed the key points of her testimony. Wyatt remained vigilant, dividing his attention between the window and the strategy discussion, occasionally offering a supportive nod or reassuring glance when Lillian's voice faltered. When Marshal Reynolds arrived with his deputies, the reality of what was about to happen struck Lillian with full force. After months of hiding, of living in the limbo between captivity and freedom, she was about to face her past publicly, and she hoped, put it behind her forever. The small group made their way to the courthouse via back streets, the marshal leading, his deputies flanking Lillian, with Wyatt and Thompson bringing up the rear. Few people were about at this hour, the town having settled into the mid-afternoon lull, but those who were stopped to stare at the unusual procession. The courthouse was a modest 2-story building at the end of the main street, its wooden steps worn by the traffic of justice, or what passed for it in this frontier town. Inside, the main courtroom was empty save for the clerk, who directed them to seats at the front. Judge Harrington entered from a side door moments later, a tall, imposing figure with a shock of white hair and piercing eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He nodded to Thompson, whom he clearly knew, before taking his seat at the bench. "This is a closed hearing in the matter of Eastwood versus Blackwell, petition for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty," he announced formally, though there was no audience to hear. "Mr. Thompson, you may present your client's case." What followed was the most difficult hour of Lillian's life, worse, in many ways, than the abuse itself. To recount the horrors of her marriage in this formal setting, to see the details recorded in the court clerk's neat hand, to watch the expressions of shock and disgust cross even the judge's professionally neutral face, it stripped away any protective distance she had managed to build between herself and her memories. Throughout her testimony, she was acutely aware of Wyatt's presence just behind her, his steady support a tangible force at her back. Once, when her voice broke describing a particularly brutal incident, she heard him make a sound low in his throat, a suppressed growl of anger that somehow gave her the strength to continue. When she finished, the courtroom was silent save for the scratch of the judge's pen as he made notes. Finally, he looked up, his gaze direct but not unkind. "Miss Eastwood, the court finds your testimony both credible and deeply disturbing. The evidence of extreme cruelty is overwhelming, and your grounds for divorce are more than justified." He set down his pen with an air of finality. "However, in cases such as these, I typically require the presence of the accused to offer a defense." Lillian's heart sank. Would all of this be for nothing? Would she be forced to confront Vernon face to face after all? "Your Honor," Thompson interjected smoothly, "given the documented threat Mr. Blackwell poses to my client's safety, and the substantial evidence of his violent character provided by multiple witnesses, I would request that you make an exception in this case." Judge Harrington steepled his fingers, considering. The law does allow for such exceptions in extreme circumstances. And having reviewed the statements from the saloon owner, the town doctor who treated Mr. Blackwell's previous wife for similar injuries, and the marshal's own report of Mr. Blackwell's increasingly erratic behavior, he nodded decisively. "Yes, I believe this qualifies as such a case." Relief washed over Lillian, so profound she felt momentarily lightheaded. Behind her, she heard Wyatt release a breath he'd apparently been holding. "Therefore," the judge continued, "it is the ruling of this court that the marriage between Lillian Eastwood and Vernon Blackwell is hereby dissolved on grounds of extreme cruelty. Miss Eastwood is restored to her maiden name and all rights thereto. Furthermore, given the extraordinary circumstances, the court awards Miss Eastwood a settlement of $500 from Mr. Blackwell's assets, to be collected and disbursed by this court." The sum, a substantial amount in the frontier economy, came as a shock to Lillian. It would be enough to establish herself independently, should she choose to do so. Mr. Blackwell will be notified of this ruling and the financial judgment against him, Judge Harrington concluded. The restraining order remains in effect indefinitely. Should he violate it, he will face imprisonment. He brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. "This matter is closed." It happened so quickly, the transition from married to unmarried, from bound to free, that Lillian sat stunned for several seconds before Thompson's congratulatory handshake brought her back to the present. "It's done," the lawyer said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "You're free, Miss Eastwood." Free. The word echoed in her mind as they made their way back to Thompson's office under the marshal's continued protection. Free from Vernon, free from fear, free to build whatever life she chose. She glanced at Wyatt, walking beside her with alert eyes scanning their surroundings, ever watchful despite the court's ruling. What kind of life might they build together, now that the shadow of her marriage no longer stood between them? Back at the office, Thompson poured 3 glasses of whiskey, raising his in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, an understanding smile playing at his lips as his gaze moved between Lillian and Wyatt. They drank, the liquor burning a path down Lillian's throat, warming her from the inside in a way that matched the hope blooming in her heart. "What happens now?" she asked, setting down her glass. "With Vernon, I mean. When will he be notified?" "The marshal will deliver the court's decision tomorrow," Thompson explained, "along with the restraining order and notice of the financial judgment. I won't pretend he'll take it well, but with the law so clearly against him, even Blackwell should recognize when he's beaten." Wyatt made a skeptical sound but said nothing, his expression making it clear he had his doubts about Vernon Blackwell's willingness to accept defeat. "I'd suggest you both stay out of town for a few days," Thompson continued. "Give things time to settle. The marshal will send word if there's any." Unusual reaction from Blackwell. The concern behind the lawyer's carefully chosen words wasn't lost on either of them. Vernon's temper was a wild card, his potential response to the divorce an unknown variable neither of them could predict with certainty. "We'll head back to the homestead tonight," Wyatt decided, his tone making it clear this wasn't open for debate. "After dark, when there are fewer eyes to see us leave." Thompson nodded his agreement. A wise precaution. "In the meantime, I'll have my clerk bring food and you can rest in the back room." When the lawyer had left them alone, closing the door to his private office behind him, Lillian turned to Wyatt, a mixture of emotions surging through her: relief, joy, lingering fear, and overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. For finding me in the snow, for giving me shelter, for standing by me through all of this." Wyatt shook his head, moving to take her hands in his. "You don't need to thank me, Lillian. You're the one who found the courage to escape, to testify, to reclaim your life. I just had the good fortune to be part of that journey." She looked up at him, this man who had become the center of her world in so short a time, who had shown her what real strength looked like: not domination or control, but steady support, unwavering respect, and gentle protection. "I meant what I said last night," she whispered, her heart in her eyes. "I love you, Wyatt Xavier." His hands tightened on hers, his gaze intense yet tender. "And I meant what I said in return. I love you, Lillian Eastwood." The surname, her own again, restored to her by the court's ruling, sounded right on his lips, as if she had been given back not just a name but her very identity. "When this is truly over," he continued, his voice low and serious, "when we're certain Blackwell is no longer a threat, I'd like to ask you something. Something important." The implication was clear, and Lillian's heart soared even as she nodded in understanding. Some things shouldn't be rushed, especially not when the shadow of Vernon still loomed, however diminished by the court's ruling. "When it's over," she agreed, a promise in her smile, "I'll be ready to hear it." That night, they slipped out of town under cover of darkness, taking a different route back to the homestead than they had used coming in. The journey was tense, both of them hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow that might conceal a threat. But the night remained peaceful, the stars brilliant overhead in the clear spring sky, and when they finally reached the familiar silhouette of Wyatt's cabin, Lillian felt a surge of emotion that caught her by surprise. "It feels like coming home," she said softly as they approached. Wyatt glanced at her, something warm and possessive in his gaze. "It is home," he said simply. "Your home if you want it to be." And in that moment, despite the uncertainties that still lay ahead, Lillian knew with absolute clarity that she did want it: this simple cabin, this hard but honest life, this man beside her. Wanted it with a fierceness that outshone any fear Vernon Blackwell could ever inspire. Dawn broke over the eastern hills, sending golden light spilling across the newly greened landscape surrounding the homestead. Lillian stood on the porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands, watching as Wyatt moved about the corral, checking on a mare that had foaled during the night. 3 days had passed since the divorce, hearing 3 days of cautious peace, of settling back into the rhythm of life on the homestead, of tentative plans for a future together. No word had come from town regarding Vernon's reaction to the court's decision, and with each passing day, Lillian allowed herself to hope that perhaps he had accepted his defeat and moved on. Wyatt had been patient, maintaining a respectful distance despite their declarations of love, giving her space to adjust to her new freedom. They had shared meals, conversation, and work around the property, but he had not pressed for more, understanding intuitively her need to re-establish her boundaries on her own terms. But this morning, watching him move with easy confidence among his horses, Lillian felt a certainty settling over her like the warming rays of the sun. The time for caution was past. Whatever the future held, she wanted to face it fully committed to this man who had shown her what love truly meant. Setting down her coffee cup, she descended the porch steps and made her way to the corral. Wyatt looked up as she approached, a smile lighting his features. "Mare and foal are doing well," he reported, gesturing to where the newborn colt stood on wobbly legs beside its mother. "Strong little fellow. He's beautiful," Lillian said, coming to stand beside him at the rail. "Have you named him yet?" "I thought maybe you'd like to," Wyatt suggested, his hand finding hers on the weathered wood. "Since you helped deliver him." The simple offering a place in this life he'd built, a voice in its small decisions, touched her deeply. "Promise," she said after a moment's thought. "His name is Promise." Wyatt's smile deepened, understanding the layers of meaning behind her choice. "It suits him." They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the new life before them, their hands linked on the corral rail, until Lillian gathered her courage to speak the words that had been forming in her heart all morning. "Wyatt," she began, turning to face him fully. "You said when it was over, when Vernon was no longer a threat, you had something to ask me." His expression grew serious, his blue eyes searching hers. "I did say that. I think it's over," she said softly. "I think it's time." For a heartbeat, he seemed frozen, as if her words had caught him unprepared despite their previous conversation. Then, with a deliberate movement that took her breath away, he reached into his pocket and withdrew something small. "I've been carrying this since the day before we went to town," he said, opening his palm to reveal a simple gold band. "It was my mother's. I've kept it all these years, waiting for you, though I didn't know it until you came into my life." Lillian's heart pounded in her chest as he took her hand, his own large one surprisingly gentle. "Lillian Eastwood," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I know it hasn't been long in the usual way of counting such things, but I've come to believe that some souls recognize each other instantly, that some loves don't need years to be certain." She nodded, her own vision blurring with tears of joy. "I love you," he continued. "Your strength, your kindness, your courage. I want to build a life with you not because you need my protection, but because we're better together than apart. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying all the certainty of her heart. "Yes, Wyatt Xavier, I will marry you." His smile was like the sunrise, brilliant and full of promise as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her, the simple band a perfect symbol of the uncomplicated love they shared. When he drew her into his arms, his kiss was different from their first, still gentle, but with a new confidence, a sense of rightful possession that made her heart soar. This was what love should be, what marriage could be: a partnership of equals, a shelter for each other's hearts. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the moment, the bullet splintering the corral post inches from their heads. Wyatt reacted with lightning speed, pushing Lillian to the ground and covering her body with his own as a second shot rang out, this one going wide. "Get to the cabin," he ordered, his voice transformed from loving to commanding in an instant. Now, together they scrambled toward the relative safety of the sturdy log walls, another bullet kicking up dirt at their heels as they ran. Inside, Wyatt immediately reached for the rifle above the door, checking that it was loaded. "It's him," Lillian gasped, her momentary shock giving way to cold clarity. "Vernon." Wyatt nodded grimly, moving to the window to peer cautiously through the curtains. "He's on the ridge to the east. Alone from what I can see." As if in answer, Vernon's voice carried across the distance, slurred with what Lillian recognized as drunken rage. "I know you're in there, you whore. Come out and face what you've done." Lillian flinched at the familiar vitriol, but her fear was different now, not the paralyzing terror of her marriage, but a clear-eyed understanding of the danger they faced. "He's drunk," she told Wyatt. "That makes him more dangerous, less predictable." Wyatt's expression was focused, calculating. "It also makes his aim worse," he observed. "Otherwise, that first shot would have done more than damage the fence." Another shot punctuated his assessment, this one shattering a window on the far side of the cabin. Glass sprayed across the floor as Wyatt pulled Lillian deeper into the shelter of the central room. "I need to end this," he said, his voice taut with controlled anger, "before he gets lucky or decides to set fire to the place." "No," Lillian clutched at his arm, sudden terror gripping her. "He'll kill you. That's what he wants, to draw you out." "I'm not going out the front," Wyatt assured her. "There's a trapdoor in the pantry floor, leads to a root cellar with an exit behind the barn. I'll circle around, come up behind him." The plan made tactical sense, but the thought of Wyatt facing Vernon alone filled Lillian with dread. "Let me come with you, I can help." He shook his head firmly. "I need you to stay here, keep him distracted. Make noise, let him think we're both still inside." "Wyatt," she began, but he silenced her with a quick, fierce kiss. "Trust me," he said against her lips. "I'll come back to you. We have promises to keep, remember." The reference to their newly made engagement, to the colt they had named together, steadied her. She nodded, swallowing her fear. "Be careful, always am." With a final reassuring touch, he moved toward the pantry, rifle in hand. Left alone in the main room, Lillian gathered her courage, moving carefully to the shattered window. "Vernon," she called, keeping herself hidden from view. "This is madness. The court has ruled." "It's over." His answering laugh was chilling in its unhinged quality. "Nothing's over until I say it is. You think some judge's paper can take what's mine?" "You're my wife." "Not anymore," she replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm free of you, forever." "You'll never be free of me," he snarled, punctuating his words with another shot that splintered the window frame. "Not while you're breathing." The nakedness of the threat, the clear intent behind it, should have terrified her. Instead, Lillian found a strange calm settling over her. Vernon had no power over her anymore, not legally, not emotionally. His bullets might end her life, but they couldn't touch her spirit, couldn't undo the freedom she had claimed. "Is that what you did to Alina?" she called, playing for time as she imagined Wyatt making his way through the root cellar. "Your first wife. Is that why she disappeared?" The question was a shot in the dark, based on rumors she had heard during her early days at Vernon's ranch. But the sudden silence that followed told her she had struck a nerve. "You don't know what you're talking about," Vernon said finally, his voice dangerously quiet even across the distance. "Alina left, went back east." "Did she?" Lillian pressed. "Or did she try to leave you like I did?" "Did she run, Vernon, and did you catch her?" Another shot, this one wild, well over the cabin roof. She had rattled him good. An angry, distracted Vernon was less likely to notice Wyatt's approach. "Shut up," he roared. You think you're so smart with your fancy Boston upbringing. You're nothing. Nothing but the rest of his tirade was cut short by a sharp command that carried clearly in the morning air. Drop the rifle, Blackwell. Wyatt's voice, coming from somewhere behind Vernon on the ridge. Lillian's heart leaped. He had made it, had outflanked her former husband, Xavier. Vernon's tone was venomous. Should have known you'd be sneaking around like a coward, says the man shooting at an unarmed woman, Wyatt replied, his voice steady. Drop the rifle, now. Lillian held her breath, straining to hear what was happening on the ridge. For a long, tense moment, there was silence. Then Vernon's voice again, deceptively calm. All right, I'm putting it down. The sound of a rifle being set on rocky ground carried in the still morning air. Lillian allowed herself a moment of hope. Perhaps this would end peacefully after all. Then chaos erupted. The rapid crack of revolver fire, 3 shots in quick succession. A shout of pain. The sound of a struggle, of men grappling on rough ground. Unable to bear the uncertainty, Lillian ran to the door and out onto the porch, her gaze frantically searching the ridge where the confrontation was taking place. What she saw froze her blood. Wyatt and Vernon locked in desperate combat, rolling dangerously close to the edge of the steep ridge. Vernon had a revolver, its barrel glinting in the morning sun as he tried to bring it to bear on Wyatt. Wyatt gripped Vernon's wrist, keeping the weapon pointed away as they struggled. Without conscious thought, Lillian ran toward them, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't know what she could do, only that she couldn't stand by while the man she loved fought for both their lives. As she neared the base of the ridge, a shot rang out, followed by a cry of pain. For a horrible moment, she couldn't tell who had been hit. Then she saw Wyatt stagger, clutching his side, blood seeping between his fingers. Vernon, seizing his advantage, raised the revolver again, a look of triumphant malice on his face. No, Lillian screamed, scrambling up the rocky slope, desperate to reach them, to do something, anything. The sound distracted Vernon just enough. He turned his head toward her, his expression contorting with renewed rage. You're next, you faithless. In that split second of diverted attention, Wyatt lunged forward despite his wound, tackling Vernon with a force born of desperate protection. The impact sent both men sliding toward the ridge edge, the loose shale giving way beneath them. Lillian could only watch in horror as they went over a tangle of limbs, disappearing from her sight. A sickening thud, then silence. Wyatt. She screamed, her voice raw with terror as she scrambled the rest of the way up the ridge. Peering over the edge, she saw them both lying motionless on the slope below, Wyatt on his back, Vernon crumpled awkwardly beside him. For one terrible moment, she thought they were both dead. Then Wyatt stirred, a groan escaping him as he tried to push himself upright. Relief swept through Lillian with such force her knees nearly buckled. Don't move, she called, already plotting the safest path down to him. I'm coming. The descent was treacherous, loose rocks shifting beneath her feet, threatening to send her tumbling. But she moved with the care of someone whose sole focus was reaching the person they loved most in the world. When she finally reached Wyatt's side, the extent of his injuries became clear: a bullet wound in his side, bleeding steadily but not gushing, a gash on his forehead from the fall, his left arm bent at an unnatural angle that spoke of a break. "Lillian," he murmured, his eyes finding hers with effort. "Are you hurt?" Even now, his first concern was for her. The realization brought tears to her eyes as she quickly tore strips from her petticoat to press against his bullet wound. "I'm fine. Don't try to talk. Save your strength." His gaze moved past her to where Vernon lay. "Is he?" Lillian glanced over her shoulder at the still form of her former husband. From this angle, she could see what she hadn't been able to from above: the unnatural twist of his neck, the vacant stare of his open eyes. There was no doubt. "He's dead," she confirmed, feeling nothing but a distant relief that the threat he posed was finally, truly ended. Wyatt closed his eyes briefly, not in celebration but in a kind of weary acceptance. "Self-defense," he murmured. "He shot first." "I know," she soothed, continuing to apply pressure to his wound. "Everyone will know. He came to our property with a rifle firing at us. There's no question of your innocence, our property." The words came naturally, a confirmation of the future they had pledged to each other just before Vernon's attack, a future that still lay before them, if she could get Wyatt the help he needed. "I need to get you back to the cabin," she said, assessing the challenge of moving a man considerably larger than herself down the rest of the slope and across the property. "Can you stand if I help you?" Wyatt grimaced but nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Been through worse in the war. Just give me a minute." That minute stretched into 5 as Lillian worked to bind his wound as best she could with the limited resources at hand. When she had done all she could, she helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as he swayed dangerously. "One step at a time," she encouraged, guiding him down the gentlest path she could find. The journey back to the cabin was a testament to both Wyatt's endurance and Lillian's strength of will. By the time they reached the porch steps, he was leaning heavily on her, his face gray with pain and blood loss. Inside, she helped him onto the bed, working quickly to clean and properly dress his wounds. The bullet had passed through his side without hitting any vital organs, a lucky break amid the day's chaos. His arm was another matter, the bone clearly broken and requiring proper setting. "I need to go for the doctor," she said, when she had done all she could with her limited medical knowledge. "You've lost a lot of blood and that arm needs professional attention." Wyatt's hand caught hers weakly. "Vernon," he reminded her, "can't leave him up there." She understood his concern, both practical and moral. A body left exposed would attract predators, and despite everything, Vernon deserved the basic dignity of a proper burial. "I'll send the doctor with the marshal," she promised. "They'll handle it. Right now, you're my priority." His eyes, clouded with pain but still aware, searched hers. "Be careful," he murmured. "The trail to town, I know the way," she assured him, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "Rest. I'll be back with help as soon as I can." The ride to Pinecrest was the fastest Lillian had ever made, pushing Wyatt's horse Midnight to a gallop whenever the terrain allowed. In town, her appearance a woman alone, clothes bloodstained, riding astride like a man, caused a stir, but she ignored the stares and whispers, heading straight for the doctor's office. Within the hour, she was leading a small party back to the homestead doctor. Morris, Marshal Reynolds, and one of his deputies. They found Wyatt conscious but weak, his condition stable but concerning. As the doctor tended to him, Lillian recounted the morning's events to the marshal, who listened with grave attention before heading up to the ridge with his deputy to confirm her account and retrieve Vernon's body. "You won't be charged," the marshal assured her upon his return. "Clear case of self-defense, just like you said. Blackwell violated the restraining order, fired first, threatened both your lives. No jury in the territory would convict Mr. Xavier, even if it came to that, which it won't." The relief of those words, the official closing of this terrible chapter, washed over Lillian like a cleansing rain. It was over. Truly, finally over. Dr. Morris emerged from the bedroom, wiping his hands on a clean towel. "He'll recover," he announced, his tone professional but kind. "The bullet wound is clean, went straight through without hitting anything vital. I've set the arm clean break, should heal well with proper rest. He's lost blood, but he's strong. Keep him in bed for at least a week, longer if you can manage it, though I suspect that'll be a challenge." "Thank you, Doctor," Lillian said, her voice thick with gratitude, "for coming so quickly." "Just doing my job, Mrs. Blackwell, or I suppose it's Miss Eastwood again now," he corrected himself, having been briefed by the marshal. "Soon to be Mrs. Xavier, actually," she said, surprising herself with the public acknowledgement of their engagement. The doctor smiled, genuine warmth in his weathered face. "Then congratulations are in order despite the circumstances. He's a good man. You both deserve some happiness after all this." As the doctor and the lawman prepared to leave, taking Vernon's body to town for a proper but simple burial, Lillian felt a strange sense of transition washing over her. One chapter closing, another beginning a life no longer defined by fear and survival, but by love and possibility. Wyatt was awake when she returned to his bedside, his eyes finding hers immediately. "You're still here," he murmured, relief evident in his voice. "Where else would I be?" she asked, taking his uninjured hand in hers. "This is home. You are home." His fingers tightened weakly around hers. "The marshal said it was clear self-defense," she assured him. "There won't be any charges. Vernon's body is being taken to town. It's over, Wyatt, really over," he nodded, wincing slightly at the movement. "Then we can finally start our life together." "We already have," she said softly, raising his hand to her lips. "But yes, without shadows now." His smile, though pained, held all the promise of their future, a future they would build together on this land that had brought them to each other through the most unlikely of circumstances. "I love you, Lillian Eastwood," he whispered. "Soon to be Lillian Xavier." "I love you too," she replied, her heart full to bursting with the simple truth of those words. "Rest now. I'll be right here when you wake." And she was that day and all the days that followed, as winter gave way to the full bloom of spring, as Wyatt healed and regained his strength, as they worked side by side to prepare for the wedding that would formalize what their hearts already knew to be true. They were married on a perfect June day, with wildflowers carpeting the hills around the homestead and the promise of summer in the air. Thompson served as witness, along with Dr. Morris and his wife, the small gathering perfect for two people who had found their greatest happiness in quiet moments together. As they spoke their vows beneath the spreading branches of an old oak tree, Lillian thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment, from the desperate flight through snow that had nearly claimed her life, to the arms of the man who had not only saved her, but shown her what love truly meant. "I promise to cherish and protect you," Wyatt said, his voice steady and sure as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring. "Not because you need protection, but because what we have is worth protecting. I promise to respect your strength, to support your dreams, to walk beside you rather than ahead or behind. And I promise to love you, Lillian Eastwood, for all the days of my life." Her own vows, spoken through tears of joy, echoed his sentiments, adding promises born of her unique path. To never take freedom for granted, to face challenges together rather than alone, to build a home based on mutual respect and unfailing love. When the circuit preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in cheers that seemed to ring across the hills, carrying the news of their union to the very skies above. Later, as twilight settled over the land and their guests departed for town, Lillian and Wyatt stood on the porch of the cabin, their cabin now in name as well as fact, watching the first stars appear in the deepening blue. "Mrs. Xavier," Wyatt murmured, his arm around her waist, drawing her close against his side. "How does it sound?" Lillian leaned into him, savoring the strength and gentleness that had become her sanctuary. "Like the name I was always meant to have," she replied, tilting her face up to his. "Like coming home." His kiss was tender, a promise of the night to come and all the nights that would follow, nights no longer haunted by fear but illuminated by love. And in the years that followed, as their family grew, first with the arrival of a daughter with Wyatt's blue eyes and Lillian's auburn hair, then a son with his father's quiet strength and his mother's quick mind, the homestead flourished under their joint care, becoming known throughout the territory as a place of warmth and welcome. Sometimes, on winter nights when the snow fell softly outside their window, Lillian would remember that desperate flight that had led her to Wyatt's door, bare feet bleeding in the snow, heart pounding with terror, certain that death awaited in the freezing darkness. But those memories no longer held power over her. They were simply the first steps on a path that had led her home to this man, this life, this love that had healed wounds deeper than any the cold had inflicted. And on those nights, with Wyatt's arms around her and their children sleeping peacefully in the rooms they had added to the once solitary cabin, Lillian would offer a silent prayer of gratitude for the strange miracle of it all, how the darkest night of her life had led, ultimately, to the brightest dawn.